I'm Matt.
I'm Kerry.
We are the Stagmer brothers, a Baltimore knife and sword. We're going to be building some of your favorite weapons, and some weapons that you've never seen before.
This is Man-at-Arms, Reforged.
We want to thank Soul Calibur for sponsoring this episode.
With the 20th anniversary of Soul Calibur, for Soul Calibur 6, we've decided to build both Soul Calibur and Soul Edge. They are ornate, huge, intricate, and beautiful. So for Soul Calibur, we've got these massive forgings. We'll get our sizing, and then we'll have to switch over to Soul Edge, which is a massive thing with organic elements to it, big eye and all kinds of form. It's a little outside of what we normally do. But we'll be able to bring it all together and show you how we can destroy things with these when we get to the end.
To begin forging our Soul Calibur blades, we've decided to make one of the most complicated swords we've probably ever made even more complicated by making the blades out of Damascus or pattern welded steel. What we have is some 1095 and some 15 and 20. We have some big thick pieces of 1095 that we're gonna add just to beef up the billet, give us some extra mass. The 15 and 20 will etch bright, and the 1095 will etch really dark, showing a really nice contrasted pattern along the entire blade. Should be beautiful. Now we'll just go ahead and tack weld these together as one solid billet, and then Ilya's gonna forge weld it into one solid piece, do a couple folds, and then split the billet into two pieces to make both our twin blades.
Soul Calibur was formed from the shards of Soul Edge. I'm not going to go make Soul Edge and then break it just so I can make Soul Calibur and then make Soul Edge again. This is a sword company, and we test our blades rigorously. So I have a whole bunch of broken Damascus bits that I'm going to be welding up periodically onto the main billet.
With the initial forge weld now done on the billet, Ilya's gonna start adding the broken shards of the blade to the billet as he goes. He's gonna work it, hot cut, fold, and just keep adding pieces until we have the desired mass in the billet, enough to create two very long sword blades.
The Soul Calibur and the Soul Edge have the abilities to adapt to their wielder spirit and personalities. So, for example, in Soul Calibur 6, we will have the Soul Edge that will adapt to Siegfried, because Siegfried is Nightmare, and Siegfried has a really big weapon, sword that is really heavy, and we have Xiangfa that has Chinese swords based on the traditional Jian that is becoming Soul Calibur. It will be a bit bigger and forceful. It's still elegant, I think.
So I'm going to begin cutting out the sections for Soul Edge. This thing is so large, it doesn't even fit on my plasma table. So what I've done is I've taken a 6-foot sheet of the chromoly alloy that we use for our blades. I've laid out the distances top and bottom for the blade. I'm just going to draw that, and I'm going to use the hand plasma. I'll cut all that out, use that as my template for the second half, because it's going to be formed like a plow to make that massive form.
The Soul Edge represents power and corruption, the bad sides of humanity. Every evil character would like to have it to destroy the world, to take revenge, to get stronger, to have more power. And you have some other characters, like Xiangfa, my main character, that wants to seek for this sword just to destroy it. Her main weapon is actually the Soul Calibur, so it's the perfect sword to defeat this evil sword.
So this is the lower form. It's the hollow section below the eye. You'll see as we do the other side, we'll clamp the two together, we'll grind this irregularity out. It'll go pretty quick, and then we'll begin to build the big form of the base of this blade.
With the folds now complete and the layer count almost around 1,000, it's time to start drawing out our blades.
Now that Ilya has consolidated the material he needs, to remove the excess tang from the other sword blade, he'll pour some water over the hot steel and then break it off. This is often much faster than waiting for something to cool down and using a saw. Now he goes back to the hammer and draws out the blades. He'll leave it fairly thick as he still has to do some cut work for ornamentation.
With our 2 Damascus bars now forged out quite a bit to length, it's time to start establishing our pattern. I'm gonna use a hand grinder, clamp our bars in the vise, and just score lines all the way down the bars. And once Ilya forges that out to its final length, it'll create what's called a ladder pattern.
Once the necessary material has been removed, it's time to flatten and draw out the blade. Flattening at this stage will disrupt the pattern just enough to produce the effect known as the ladder. I'm going to start forging on this blade while Matt finishes removing the material from the second one.
Now that we have both our main edge pieces cut out on the plasma, for our soul edge, it's time to just move to the grinder, true everything up. My goal here is just to grind these as close as possible so when we weld them together, everything matches up.
Now that he has the length, he'll hand forge the tip on the sword. We wouldn't really worry too much about that. We'd often grind these, but when we have a pattern from the pattern welding, it's very important that you do this with forging. It'll change the way the pattern goes around the tip, and it's very obvious to an experienced eye.
The blade is curving towards the edge rather than away from the edge, and maintains mostly a straight shape. And that's because I'm using the proper hammer technique. When you're hammering right, you're basically throwing the hammer through the anvil to the other side, and you're compressing the steel onto itself. And all the forces are equal between the hammer, the anvil, and side to side. As a result, the blade becomes straight. You can forge for much longer, since you're creating heat rather than losing it, and your Damascus pattern is nice and beautiful instead of odious.
So when we got the original artwork for Soul Calibur 6 for this weapon build, one of the things they sent us was a 3D object file. We decided that what we do is we go ahead and print one to kind of see how this pommel's going to work out. I brought my brother in. This is Emery Stagmer.
Hey.
He's a flight software engineer at a major aerospace company here in the area. And the 3D printers live at his house, and he's doing the programming. And so I'm going to let him tell you what he did to kind of figure these pieces out.
So this is the size that it came in when I originally printed it at its original scale. Anytime you have an undercut like this, you have to support it from underneath so that the hot plastic doesn't droop. I was running it too hot, so I had to cool it down. The second try is quite a bit bigger. The supported material is a little bit better. The scale there is larger, and actually the layers are thinner, so we get a better resolution in the curves up here. So then when we finally got up to this one, it's printed yet even cooler. This is a 13-hour print. And you can see this is all just support material under here. So we can break these support materials out with just a pair of pliers. So you can see these underneath curves are pretty good. The outside edge here is pretty thick. And you start to see the faces. The faces came out great. The kind of a hooked nose, and really very cool.
It certainly is something that we could work directly from, and this gives us our scale so we know size-wise what we want the piece to be. So I just wanted to thank you for coming by and dealing with this, you know.
It's great fun.
Good ladder patterning takes a long time, as you have to space your cuts fairly evenly. Thus, by the time Matt is done patterning, I'm completed with the first blade, and I'm ready to start on the new one.
As Ilya forges the second blade, he'll continually stop and compare it to the first. These are mirror images of each other, and he'll have to make sure they're very close before grinding.
All right, both our Soul Calibur blades are now forged. It's pretty awesome. Two very organic pieces turned out perfectly. I just have to start by truing up the perimeter. Each hammer blow adds a little bit of regularity. Then I can move on to grinding the edges. The bevels are already established during the forging process, so I already have guidelines in these blades to go. I just have to start grinding on them, get them down to the proper thickness, and then we can heat treat.
For Soul Calibur, the pommel is a very specific form. It's anthropomorphic, which means a human form. This one is specifically female. She has 4 faces, one facing forward, 2 to each side, and 1 in the back. Her body is a mirror image on the front and the back. So this is a very unique piece, and I've chosen polymer clay to do the sculpt. And I have an armature here that I've created. Just gonna start molding it into shape until I get the form that I want. What's nice about this polymer clay is it can be baked in an oven at 275 degrees and it'll fully harden and cure. We'll then make a mold of it and use it to inject wax into, which will then be used in the lost wax casting process to make the pommel. As you can see, I've made a lot of forward progress here. I only have 1 face though, and not 4. Now the reason for this is I'm gonna make a mold of it after it's been hardened. We're gonna make a front and a back, and then take 2 faces from the mold and assemble them onto the sides of the face.
The blade's now rough ground. It's time to move on to heat treat. We can't allow these blades to saber or bend whatsoever because they're gonna be mounted side by side. So Ilya's gotta be super careful with his heat and make sure the quench is nice and even. After the first quench is complete, Ilya hands the blade off to me while it's still nice and warm. I now move to the vise and do a little bit of straightening. Everything turned out great. To temper our 2 blades, we're going to use a hot oil bath heated up to about 420 degrees. Rick places those blades into the hot oil, leaves them there for about 2 hours. Once they're cooled down, they'll be ready for their final grinding.
Now that these blades have been heat treated, Matt will begin doing the finishing grinding and polishing. It'll take an extreme amount of time to do these long blades. He's got to be very careful and produce high finishes so that when we take them to the etch, all the pattern is revealed.
To create the central section, John will move to the plasma cutter to cut out 2 equal patterns that will later weld together as one.
To make the handle for Soul Edge, I select 3 pieces of 1018 1-inch square. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to round this over unevenly on the power hammer. The unevenness is necessary as it replicates the texture that you see in the game. After the pieces are round, they're going to be welded and twisted in the press with the assistance of several people, as the structure to be twisted will be very thick. Once I cut the sections for Soul Edge handle to size, I use the leftover clip-offs to begin the guard section of Soul Calibur. What I'm going to do, I'm going to narrow them down and flare the tips to make the serpent tail motif. That way Soul Edge and Soul Calibur will always be tied together, as they share the same origin.
After we've taken the round bar and flared it out, it's time to lay in our texture to make the wings. I will assist Ilya by holding the material as he uses a hammer and a chisel to create the proper texture.
So I've made the mold off the master that Rick sculpted. I just took his object and glued it to the bottom of this, pour it in the mold compound and let it sit for a day. Well, I want to try and get this out without actually cutting anything. And knowing that the sculpture is glued to the bottom, it should just be a matter of once I have the rubber out, I can just pop it open and pop the original out. We'll be able to just put molten wax into here. It'll come around, we'll be able to pop out a series of them, and we'll be able to make the master for our pommel.
With the texture now in, it's time to start our form. These two pieces basically coil around the central orb. So Ilya is going to move to the horn of the anvil and start the coil-like bend. This will take several heats, but in the end, it'll be just right. The bend itself isn't that difficult. The tricky part is making two exactly the same.
Every character in Soul Calibur has a different kind of fighting style. You will see by the weapon they have if they are fast or slow, what kind of distance they have with their weapon. Siegfried has a very big weapon, so he's slow, but the damage are very important and he can reach very far with his weapon. In other games, you don't care if the character is left-handed or right-handed, but in this game, it's very important to know that because, for example, Xiongfa is right-handed, so you will know how to avoid her moves by stepping on the right because she's right-handed, and Siegfried is left-handed, for example, and I think it adds more difficulties to the game, but it's also so nice to see such details because even in real life, the persons also have left-handed or right-handed preference.
So now I'm going to be casting the pommel for Soul Calibur. You saw Rick do this sculpture. I made 4 waxes for him so that he could do the front and the back, which are the same, and then cut the heads off and add them in. What I'm going to be doing now is I'll set a flask around the outside of it. I'll mix up investment, which is plaster with silicate in it. We'll vacuum, debubble it so that it's nice and clean. It'll get poured around here. Once that sets up, we'll be able to go to the kiln, melt the wax out, and pour in the Britannia melt.
Matt and Ilya now twist the 3 bars together to create the handle section on Soul Edge. This is fairly difficult. These are solid pieces. They'll be using large wrenches, twisting this around. We'll then have to form this piece and create the pommel as well.
So I've used some of the epoxy clay and sculpted the eye in the Soul Edge sword. We've got a nice concave surface. We're sanding it smooth. We're going to do a base coat of paint on here. Then I'll move on to doing the details of the iris, the veining, and the coloration.
With the investment now fully cured and up to temperature, Kerry places it into the casting machine and takes the electromelt that is full of molten Britannia and pours it in.
We finished sanding, putting the base coat of color on. I've done all the detail painting on this one, added in the thread veining and all the background colors. We've started to build up the clear coats on this. We'll move on to the other side of the eye, which I've done the base coat, and start the detailing on that one. I'm going to keep working on the iris on this, then I'll do the outside painting and the rest of the eyeball, add that thread veining in, clear coat, and we'll have a match for the other side.
To create the edge for this weapon, Ilya takes a section of 1045, knocks it down into a bar, and draws it out to create the shape we need.
I'm using a clear glue. I've frayed the thread and I'm laying this in and gluing it down.
Working from the design that we plasma cut, Ilya is going to be shaping this bar. When we create the form of this piece, that bar will be the strong backbone that we build everything on. I was finally able to get the pommel out of the investment and get it clean. Rick will now go through, trim all the flashing, and clean the surfaces.
So I have the primary sections of this welded up. We've spread it out. Got to have room for the eye. But even now, this is a pretty heavy thing. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go in, start blending this weld. We've got our hard steel for the front edge that we've welded in place in the center. So I've got to leave that and get an edge down on it. I'm pretty sure we're going to have to swap off to a couple of guys. To create some of the final fittings for Soul Calibur, we're going to be working from this ball that you see. It gets supported by claws from above, claws from below, that then attach to the wing sections and go down to the blade. The upper claws go to a flange. That flanging section is going to be up where the handle sits down on top. So it's that double flange that I'm going to be cutting. I'm going to cut into the face here. I've bored a 1-inch hole through. That's really just so that I have a tang area to come through and then meet the handle. Once I've made that cut, I can come back to the outside and I'll be cutting that V shape that causes the flange and actually takes a huge amount of weight out of this piece. And that'll be the final section that I need. Then I've got all the pieces I can stack up through to create this sword.
Today I am actually covering a handle in chainmail. This is European 421 chainmail. To start, you need to take one link and add 4 links to it. You want to line it up in a specific way, 1 row facing upward and 2 rows facing downward. You just keep connecting, but now you're connecting 2. And as you can see, it still maintains the 4-to-1 concept because this link in the middle is going to be followed by a link that goes through these 2 next links. I'm going to keep on adding more links, and hopefully soon we will see a very awesome sword hilt.
Since we're doing a lot of hand hammering to create the forms for this weapon, I'm just going to do some rough cutting using the hand plasma. I'll get it into Bill's hand, and as he begins to raise that form, we'll be able to grind it and take off all the excess material.
So here I have the top of our Soul Edge sword. What I have to do now is I have to go through and add a bit more shape to the sides here to kind of make it a bit more like a muscle. What I'm going to do now is just take my hammer, go into this dishing stake, adding a bit more form.
When I think of the 20th anniversary of Soul Calibur, I'm thinking, oh, I'm getting old. Because I started when I was 7 years old. And I grew up really with it. I was going in tournaments, I was traveling all over the world. So now, Soul Calibur 6 has been announced, and I really have to stop working a little in France because I want to be a professional player for Soul Calibur 6.
To create the border for our back fin piece, John's going to be welding on some round rod and carefully shaping it and welding it as he goes. This will complete the border of our piece.
One of the key touches on the crossguard assembly is to introduce the runes that are present in the game. I'm going to use a fairly large hammer and a fairly large cutter, and I'm going to cut in the design. Now, the procedure is technically engraving, however, the tools are so big, it's more proper to call this chiseling.
The Soul Calibur competitive scene has a lot of history. It started with the France and America rivalry in 2001. I was only 10 years old, and I beat an American champion 10-3. In 2003, the French champion won. But after that, in 2004, an American team came to France to defeat us, and the American champion at that time won the tournament. In 2012, it was a Japanese player that won. It made us very curious to travel to Japan to compete against the best Japanese players.
To create what looks like 3 eyes, John drills 3 holes up either side of the blade, and then places grommets in a bolt to create the final look. It's now time to forge our claws that capture the central orb. Ilya is going to use a piece of stock and forge our claws to shape. After he gets his rounded shape, he draws out the points on the end of the claws. To get a nice smooth rounded area, Ilya is using a hardy tool with the proper shape. Ilya will be welding rods to attach to our handle that run the full length of the blade, creating a web-like structure that will not only add strength to the build, but will allow us to add all the other pieces to them later.
Bill uses an old technique that we did when we used to make a lot of armor. He's going to take WD-40 and spray it on the surface as he uses a torch to heat it. That's going to blue the surface. It retains a very permanent color like this.
With our blades now polished out from 400 to a Scotch-Brite, I'm using some acetone on a rag just to remove any excess oil or anything that could really be on the surface of the blade that could contaminate the etch or really disturb the surface of the pattern. We're gonna leave these blades in the ferric chloride for about 45 minutes, maybe an hour, until the pattern really shows. But let's go ahead and get a sneak peek of what the pattern will look like. It's really pretty.
The community has always been passionate about this game, and it's been 7 years that we are waiting for this. And I'm happy because this game is going to gather the new players that have never played Soul Calibur before, but it will also satisfy the old community like me. That's what nourishes the players, the competitive scene, to play and travel. And I hope that it's not only France, America and Japan. I hope it's really worldwide and that we will see many countries in the game.
Now that Soul Edge is near completion, the guys have created a plate for the inside. We've perforated with holes. They've ground it up real good so I can get a good bite. I'm going to begin to build this up with a car body putty and natural rope, fill in the concave eye, get that set in, smear some putty in there, and begin to use the putty to actually glue our first rope down, and we'll start to build it up from there and get it finished.
It was a first for us here on Man-at-Arms to make such massive builds and to make 2 of them. There were so many requests for one or the other or for both that we made the decision and stepped up on this.
We want to thank Soul Calibur 6 for sponsoring this episode. Make sure to play this game and check these swords in action. Soul Calibur 6 will be released on October 19.